What if your childhood dollhouse wasn't just a toy, but a gateway? A miniature stage where something truly sinister decided to play. Welcome, dwellers of the dark, to Nocturnal Nightmares TV. Tonight, we are unlocking the doors to a terror that hides in plain sight, within the most innocent of childhood objects. We are about to expose the terrifying reality behind 5 ordinary dollhouses that became vessels for unspeakable evil. These aren't just creepy tales told in the dark. These are true accounts that will make you question what truly lurks within the seemingly harmless things we keep in our homes. This isn't just entertainment. It's a terrifying warning. You will never look at a dollhouse the same way again. Story 1. The Blackwood Manor replica. It began with a gift from my grandmother, a peace offering after a bitter family argument. The dollhouse was a masterpiece, a perfect, handcrafted replica of Blackwood Manor. The sprawling Victorian mansion our family had owned for generations before selling it off a decade ago. Every detail was perfect, from the tiny stained glass windows to the miniature portrait of my great-grandfather hanging in the study. My 8-year-old daughter, Clara, was enchanted. I, however, felt a prickle of unease from the moment we set it up in her room. The real Blackwood Manor had a dark history, a place of hushed scandals and a tragic, unexplained death. My great-aunt Elspeth, who had allegedly fallen from the attic window. The first strange occurrence was subtle, easily dismissed. Clara was playing, arranging the tiny doll family a mother, a father, a little girl, and a boy in the miniature living room. I left to make lunch. When I returned, the dolls were no longer in the living room. They were all in the attic, arranged in a neat, tight circle, facing each other. Clara, honey, I thought we were playing downstairs, I asked. She looked up at me, her expression confused. I didn't move them. Mummy, she said, her voice a small whisper. The little girl in the grey dress did. A chill traced its way down my spine. There was no doll wearing a grey dress, but I remembered an old, faded photograph of my great-aunt Elspeth as a child. She had been wearing a simple, grey dress. I told myself it was just a child's overactive imagination, fueled by the stories she'd overheard about our family. But the rearrangements continued. We would find the furniture in the dollhouse moved, always in the middle of the night. A tiny chair would be overturned. The miniature dining table would be set for one. A single empty plate in the center. The most unsettling change was the dolls. We would often find the little girl doll lying on the miniature lawn, directly beneath the attic window, in a twisted, broken pose. Every time I would move it, put it back in its bed, the next morning I would find it on the lawn again. It was a reenactment, a silent, constant replay of a long-forgotten tragedy. The whispers started a week later, a faint, dry, rustling sound from Clara's room at night. It sounded like a little girl humming a sad, tuneless lullaby. When I'd go in to check, Clara would be fast asleep. The humming would be coming from the dollhouse. It was so faint, I could have convinced myself it was the house settling, the wind, anything. But I knew. The true horror began when the dollhouse started to predict the future, or, more accurately, when it started to write it. One morning, I found the father doll in the kitchen, lying on its back, one of its tiny, plastic legs snapped off. That afternoon, my husband, on his way home from work, was in a fender bender. A minor accident, but he was left with a severely broken leg. A coincidence, a terrible, chilling coincidence. A few days later, I found the boy doll in the miniature study, slumped over the tiny desk, a single red bead placed on its back. That night, my son came down with a violent, inexplicable fever, a rash of bright red spots covering his back. The doctor was baffled. He recovered, but the pattern was undeniable. The dollhouse wasn't just a stage for the past. It was a script for the future. The entity within, the sad, lonely spirit of my grotaunt Elspeth, was not just replaying her own tragedy. She was creating new ones, a malevolent, childish game of house, where the consequences were real and devastating. The final night, I decided to end it. I told Clara the dollhouse had to go, that it was broken. She didn't argue. She just looked at it with a sad, knowing expression. "She doesn't want us to leave," Clara whispered. That night, I was woken by a loud crash from Clara's room. I ran, and the dollhouse was on the floor, its roof smashed, its delicate furniture scattered. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Clara was not in her bed. Her window, the one that overlooked the steep drop to the backyard, was wide open. I rushed to it, my heart seizing in my chest, and I saw her. Clara, in her white nightgown, was standing on the lawn below, looking up at me. She was safe. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. But as I looked at her, at my daughter, I noticed something was wrong. She was standing in the exact spot where the doll had always been, directly beneath the window. And she was standing in that same twisted, broken pose. She tilted her head, and a slow, cold, ancient smile spread across her face. It was not my daughter's smile, and from her mouth, in a dry, rustling whisper that was not her voice, came a single, chilling phrase. "Now you have to stay and play with me forever." Story 2. The Saltbox Prison. My ex-husband, Daniel, and I were what you'd call amateur housemen. We bought wrecks and tried to breathe life into them. The old Saltbox house on the coast of Maine was supposed to be our masterpiece. It was a ruin, abandoned for 50 years, but it had good bone. We found the dollhouse in the sealed-off attic, a space that hadn't been opened since the 1920s. It was a perfect, if grimy, replica of the house itself, a saltbox within a saltbox. Every room was there in miniature, every piece of furniture a tiny, perfect copy of the full-sized, rotting furniture downstairs. From the start, the dollhouse felt wrong. There was a single hand-carved male doll, dressed in the rough-spun clothes of a 19th century fisherman, sitting in a tiny rocking chair in the miniature attic. He was the only resident. When we tried to move him, he wouldn't budge. He was glued or somehow fixed to the chair. We started renovations on the main house, a long, arduous process. And as we worked, strange things began to happen, always mirroring our progress. The day Daniel replastered the living room wall, we came back the next morning to find the corresponding wall in the Dollhouse living room covered in a smooth, grey, clay-like substance that hadn't been there before. When I stripped the old, faded wallpaper in the master bedroom, we found the tiny wallpaper in the Dollhouse's bedroom had peeled away on its own. It was bizarre, a strange, impossible sympathy between the house and its miniature. But the real horror started when we tried to change the layer. Daniel wanted to knock down the wall between the two small, cramped bedrooms to create a larger master suite. The first day, he took a sledgehammer to that wall. He was plagued by a series of small, unlucky accidents. His hammer would slip, hitting his thumb. A loose floorboard would trip him. Nothing serious, but a constant, nagging interference. That night, we went up to the attic to look at the dollhouse. The fisherman doll was no longer in his rocking chair. He was now standing in the miniature hallway between the two bedrooms, his tiny, painted face turned towards the wall Daniel had been trying to demolish. He was guarding it. The next day, Daniel, a stubborn and rational man, went back to work on the wall. At 3 p.m., as he swung the sledgehammer, the head flew off the handle, ricocheted off the wall, and struck him in the head. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was serious. He was left with a concussion and a deep, ugly gash that required a dozen stitches. As he lay on the couch, recovering, I went back to the dollhouse. The fisherman doll was back in his attic rocking chair, but on the floor of the miniature hallway where he had been standing was a single, tiny, red bee. I finally understood. We weren't renovating a house. We were desecrating a tomb. The dollhouse wasn't a replica. It was a vessel, a prison, the spirit of the house's original owner. A reclusive and violently territorial fisherman was trapped inside that tiny wooden doll. He couldn't interact with our world directly, but he could manipulate the house, his larger, decaying body, to protect his miniature prison. He didn't want us to fix the house. He wanted us to leave it and him to rot in peace. The final confirmation came a week later. Daniel, now fully recovered and more determined than ever, decided to finish the job. But before he went to work on the wall, I had an idea. I went to the dollhouse. I took a small tube of superglue, and with a trembling hand, I glued the fisherman doll's feet to the floor of the attic. I sealed him in his prison. Daniel went to work. He swung the sledgehammer, and the wall came down with a thunderous crash, a cloud of plaster dust filling the air. There were no accidents, no strange phenomena, just a wall, finally broken. We had won. A triumphant, giddy relief washed over us. We went to check on the dollhouse. The fisherman doll was still glued to the attic floor, but the doll itself was a wreck. Its tiny wooden body was cracked and splintered. Its painted face was a mess of fissures, as if it had been subjected to an immense, crushing force. A single, miniature arm had been torn off at the shoulder. As we stared at it, a floorboard creaked behind us. We spun around. Standing in the doorway of the real attic was a man. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in the tattered, salt-stained clothes of a 19th century fisherman. His face was a mask of pure, incandescent rage, and his right arm was missing, torn from his body at the shoulder, leaving a ragged, dark, empty space. The dollhouse wasn't the prison. The house was. The doll was just the anchor, the point of connection. And by demolishing the wall, by changing the fundamental structure of his larger body, we had given him just enough energy, just enough rage to manifest, to break free from his miniature anchor. And by breaking the doll, we had broken him. He let out a silent scream of fury, and then he simply dissolved, like sea foam on the wind. We sold the house, unfinished, a week later. I never went back to the coast of Maine, because I know that some houses aren't just empty, they're occupied. And sometimes the smallest resident is the one you should be most afraid of. Story 3. The family that lived on the shelf, my daughter, Sophie, never had a dollhouse. What she had was a shelf. When she was 6, my father, a master carpenter, built her a beautiful 6-foot-tall bookshelf, designed to look like the front of a Tudor-style house. Each of the 5 shelves was a different floor, and she would spend hours arranging her collection of antique porcelain dolls in the little rooms she had created. There was the father, a stern-looking man with a painted-on mustache, the mother with a serene porcelain smile, the brother and sister with their rosy cheeks and glass eyes, and the baby, a tiny, fragile thing wrapped in a lace blanket. They were just dolls, until the night of the fire. A faulty wire in the kitchen started a small fire that, thankfully, was contained quickly. But the smoke damage was extensive. We had to move into a hotel for a few weeks, while the house was professionally cleaned. The day we were allowed back in, the house was immaculate. Every surface scrubbed clean, the smell of smoke replaced by the sterile scent of bleach. But Sophie's doll shelf was wrong. The dolls, which she had left arranged in a happy family scene, were now in a state of disarray. The father doll was on the top shelf, the attic turned to face the wall. The mother and the 2 children were on the floor, their porcelain limbs askew, and the baby doll was gone. We searched everywhere. It was a tiny, 2-inch-long doll. It could have fallen, been swept up by the cleaners. Sophie was heartbroken, but eventually life returned to normal. Or so I thought. I started noticing things. A faint, high-pitched whimpering sound from Sophie's room at night, like a newborn crying. When I'd check on her, she'd be fast asleep. The sound would seem to be coming from the doll shelf. I also noticed that the other dolls were never where Sophie left them. She would complain to me, her voice full of a child's frustration. "Mummy, the sad man keeps moving them. He's looking for the baby." I assumed she was talking about the father doll, and that this was her way of processing the trauma of the fire and the loss of her favorite toy. But the sad man started to become a more frequent, more sinister presence in our lives. We'd hear a man's heavy, sighing breaths from empty room. Doors would close on their own. And always, the dolls on the shelf would be moved, rearranged into frantic, searching poses. The father doll was always the most active, sometimes appearing in different rooms of the house, perched on a bookshelf or sitting at the kitchen table, a silent porcelain sentinel. The entity we had brought into our house wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was the collective, grieving spirit of the family who had died in our house. A fact the real estate agent had conveniently failed to mention. A fire 100 years ago had claimed the lives of a father, a mother, and their 2 children. But the youngest, an infant, had miraculously survived, adopted by a neighboring family. The spirits of his family remained tethered to the house, eternally searching for their lost child. The fire we had had stirred them, awakened them, and Sophie's doll shelf, a perfect effigy of a family in a house, had become their new focal point. The dolls were their avatars, their way of interacting with our world. And in the chaos of the fire, they had lost their baby all over again. The final, horrifying confirmation of what we were dealing with came on a cold, rainy afternoon. Sophie was at a friend's house. I was home alone, reading in the living room, when I heard a distinct, heavy footstep on the stairs. I froze. The footsteps continued, a slow, deliberate, mournful tread coming down the stairs. I crept to the doorway and peered into the hall, and I saw him, a tall, translucent, shimmering figure of a man in old-fashioned clothes. He was gray, ethereal, his features indistinct, but the grief radiating from him was a physical force. He reached the bottom of the stairs and turned, his shimmering, sorrowful gaze meeting mine. He opened his mouth, and a sigh, like the wind through a graveyard, filled the house. "Where is my son?" The sigh seemed to whisper, and then he was gone. I knew then that we couldn't live there anymore. The house didn't belong to us. It belonged to their grief. That night, I was packing our things, a frantic, desperate escape, when I decided to do one last search for the missing baby doll, a foolish, irrational hope that if I could find it, I could bring this family some peace. I looked under Sophie's bed, a place we had searched a dozen times, and my fingers brushed against something small and hard. It was the baby doll, but it wasn't alone. It was clutched in the hand of another doll, one I had never seen before, a small, wooden, crudely carved doll of a woman. And tied around its neck with a piece of string was a tiny, tarnished silver locket. I opened the locket. Inside was a faded, microscopic photograph of a woman, and etched onto the other side was a single name, Beatrice. I had been researching the family who had died, and I recognized the name. Beatrice was the neighbor, the woman who had adopted the surviving infant. She had died a few years after the fire, and had been buried with the child's favorite toy, the locket. The baby doll hadn't been lost. It had been found by its new mother. We had been dealing with 2 sets of ghosts. One family, desperately searching for their lost child, and another, a lonely woman and a baby, desperately trying to hide. We left that night. I left the dolls, both families, on the shelf, hoping they could finally find their peace, but I doubt they did. Story 4. The architect's model. I work as a night watchman at a large corporate architectural firm. A job that is 99% soul-crushing boredom and 1% moments of sheer, unexplained terror that make you question your own sanity. The terror at my firm resides on the 5th floor, in the main presentation room. It's a scale model of the firm's crowning achievement, the Solstice Tower, a sleek 100-story skyscraper that now dominates the city skyline. The model is a work of art, 10 feet tall, built of plastic, resin, and glass, a perfect, lifeless replica. Or so I thought. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was a light. I was doing my 2 a.m. rounds when I saw a faint, flickering light coming from the presentation room. I assumed one of the architects had left a light on in the model. They were wired with a complex LED system. I went in to turn it off, but the master switch was already off. I looked closer at the model. A single, tiny window on what would have been the 78th floor was glowing with a faint, warm, yellow light. It looked like a candle. It flickered for a few seconds, then went out. I wrote it off as a short circuit, a faulty wire in a complex model, but it kept happening. Each night, a light would appear in a different window. Sometimes a soft yellow glow, sometimes a stark blue-white light, like a television. I started keeping a log. The lights never appeared in the same room twice. They were moving as if someone or something was slowly, methodically moving through the miniature building, floor by floor, room by room. Then came the sounds. I would be doing my rounds on the 4th floor, and I'd hear a faint sound from the ceiling above. The sound of tiny, microscopic furniture being dragged across a tiny floor. A faint, high-pitched party. The sound of 100 tiny voices chattering at once. It was always coming from the presentation room, from the model. I knew I was losing my mind. I told my supervisor, a weary man named George, who had been working the night shift for 30 years. He just gave me a tired, knowing look. "It's the building," he said, his voice a low grumble. "It's settling, makes strange noises." But I saw the lie in his eyes. He knew. I started spending my nights on the 5th floor, watching the model, obsessed. I would sit in the dark, watching the tiny lights flicker to light, listening to the impossible sounds. I began to realize the model wasn't just a replica of the Solstice Tower. It was the Solstice Tower. Or rather, it was a conduit, an echo. The building had been built on the site of an old, notorious slum that had been cleared in a fire that had claimed hundreds of lives. The souls of those who had died there, the original residents of that patch of land, were still there. And when the new tower was built, they had simply moved in. They were living in the real tower, their psychic energy, their ghostly lives, echoing down into the perfect miniature replica that sat on the 5th floor. I wasn't just a watchman for a building. I was a watchman for a haunted house and its tiny, haunted echo. The night I quit, I saw a new light in the model. It was in the penthouse apartment, the highest floor. But this light was different. It was a flickering, angry, orange-red glow. As I watched, my blood turning to ice, the light grew, spreading to the windows of the floors below. And I heard a new sound. The sound of 1,000 tiny screaming voices, a chorus of microscopic agony and terror. And I smelled smoke, not real smoke. The faint, phantom smell of burning wood and ash. It was the fire, the original fire. The spirits in the tower were not just living, they were reliving. And tonight was the anniversary of their deaths. I backed away from the model, my heart pounding. I was about to turn and run when I saw it. In one of the tiny windows on the 78th floor, the one where I'd seen the first light, a figure appeared. It was a tiny, perfectly formed, translucent silhouette of a man. He was standing at the window, looking out. But he wasn't looking out at the miniature city. He was looking out at me. He raised a hand, a tiny, ghostly hand, and pressed it against the inside of the tiny plastic window. A silent, desperate plea for help. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked out of that building and never went back. I see the Solstice Tower every day. It's a beautiful, gleaming monument to modern architecture. But I know what it really is. It's a 100-story mausoleum, a vertical graveyard. And I know that in a quiet, dark room, on the 5th floor of a corporate building miles away, the lights are still flickering on the tiny furniture is still being moved. And the ghosts of 100 forgotten souls are still living, pan, and dying, and living again, trapped forever in the architect's perfect, beautiful, and utterly inescapable model. Story 5. The Dollmaker's Children. My wife, Sarah, is a collector. Her passion is antique dolls, and our house is a silent, porcelain audience of unblinking glass eyes. I never liked them, but I loved her, so I learned to live with them. Her prized possession, the one she found in a dusty antique shop in Prague, was a set of 4 marionette dolls, which she kept in her studio in a custom-built glass-fronted cabinet that looked like a miniature theater. They were exquisitely creepy, their jointed wooden limbs and painted, smiling faces, a testament to a forgotten, old-world craftsmanship. The shopkeeper had told her they were made by a famous, reclusive, Czech dollmaker from the early 19th century, a man who had no children of his own and who is said to have put a piece of his soul into each of his creations. The haunting began not with the dolls, but with Sarah. She started spending more and more time in her studio, talking to the marionettes, not like a collector, but like a mother. She would give them names, create elaborate backstories, and even read them bedtime stories. I attributed it to the stress of her job, a harmless, eccentric hobby. Then, she started to change. She became pale, thin, her movements growing stiff and jerky, like a puppet on a string. Her voice grew softer, her words more deliberate, as if someone else were pulling the strings of her vocal cords. One night, I was woken by a strange sound from her studio, a soft, rhythmic, wooden clicking. I crept to the door and peered through the keyhole. The room was dark, save for a single candle on the workbench. Sarah was standing in front of the marionette cabinet, her back to me, and the 4 dolls were out of their case. They were dancing. Their strings, which should have been hanging limp, were taut, pulled by some unseen force from the ceiling above. They were performing an intricate, silent ballet on the workbench, their wooden limbs clicking together in perfect, terrifying time. Sarah was conducting them, her hands moving in slow, graceful arcs, a serene, placid smile on her face. As I watched, paralyzed with a horror I couldn't name, she turned her head and looked directly at the door, directly at the keyhole. Her eyes were no longer the warm, brown eyes of my wife. They were as flat, black, and lifeless as polished glass. She saw me. I stumbled back from the door, my heart pounding. I ran to our bedroom and locked the door. I had finally seen the truth. The dollmaker hadn't put a piece of his soul into his creations. He had put his children's. The dolls were not just wood and paint. They were vessels, prisons for the souls of 4 long-dead children. And they were lonely. They had been sleeping for a century, and my wife, with her love, her attention, her maternal energy, had woken them up. And now they wanted a new mother. They were not possessing her. They were adopting her. The next few weeks were a descent into a quiet, domestic hell. Sarah was no longer my wife. She was a hollowed-out shell, a life-sized doll for them to play with. She would spend her days in the studio, her movements becoming more and more puppet-like. Sometimes I would find her standing in a corner for hours, perfectly still, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, a ghost of the woman she once was, trapped inside her own body. The children, the dolls, grew bolder. They were no longer confined to the studio. I would find them around the house, the little boy, Marionette, sitting at the top of the stairs, the 2 girl marionettes having a silent tea party in the living room. Their strings were always taut, leading up to a ceiling that should have held nothing, their painted smiles seeming to mock my grief and terror. They were the masters of the house now, and I was just a guest. I knew I had to break the connection. I had to free my wife, even if it meant destroying the things she had once loved. One night, while Sarah was in one of her silent, motionless states, I went into the studio. I grabbed the 4 marionettes, their wooden bodies cold and strangely heavy, in my hands. I took them to the fireplace, my hands shaking. As I was about to throw them into the flames, Sarah walked into the room. She moved with a stiff, unnatural gait, her head tilted at a strange angle. The blank, glassy look was gone from her eyes. They were filled with a cold, ancient fury. And her voice, when she spoke, was not her own. It was a chorus of 4 high-pitched, childish voices, all speaking at once, a sound of pure, innocent malice. "You will not take our mother from us," the chorus said. Then her body began to move. It wasn't her moving it. Her limbs were pulled by unseen strings, forced into a grotesque, jerking dance. Her arms and legs were thrown about at impossible angles, her joints audibly popping and cracking. She was a human marionette being torn apart by 4 angry and very powerful ghosts. She screamed, a single agonized sound that was finally, blessedly her own. And in that scream, I knew what I had to do. I didn't throw the dolls into the fire. I threw myself at Sarah, grabbing her, holding her, trying to shield her from the unseen forces that were destroying her. As I held her, I looked at the dolls, and I spoke to them, to the children trapped inside. "She is not your mother," I said, my voice thick with tears. "Let her go. Take me instead." The room went cold. The jerking movements of Sarah's body stopped. She collapsed in my arms, unconscious, and I felt a change, a sudden, profound lightness in my own limbs, a feeling of disconnect from my own muscles. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer my own. I could feel the faint, ghostly tug of a dozen invisible strings, pulling at my fingers, my wrists, my neck. The deal had been accepted. They had a new doll to play with now. I am writing this with a hand that is not entirely my own. Sarah is safe. She remembers nothing of the last few months. She just knows that I have become distant, quiet. My movements, she says, are stiff, deliberate. Sometimes she finds me standing in a corner, staring at nothing. She thinks I'm grieving the loss of her hobby. I destroyed the dolls, I told her in a fit of rage. But I know the truth. I am the new dollhouse. My body is the theater, and the dollmaker's children are finally happy. They have a new parent to play with, and they never, ever will let me go.